The last 2 weeks, we have spoken on the faith of the fathers, the faith of those who have come before us, what that means, what that looked like, how that applies to our lives today. We talked about David and his life of faith despite enormous trials. Trials brought on by himself, trials brought on by others. We talked about Josiah. We talked about the faith of Reformation and how when he found God's word, he did everything in his power, regardless of what that looked like, regardless of what that cost, to follow it. These are some of the heroes of the faith. These great men who did great things for God. Sometimes that's a little bit hard for us to relate to. We can say, oh yeah, they did all these things and they overcame all these hardships and they did all this hard work, but I could never really live up to that. So today you are without excuse. Because today we talk about the healed. Today we talk about those who had nothing, who were nothing, who came from nothing, and who likely ended with nothing as far as physical goods are concerned. These are not people who we have names for. In fact, they're just many times relegated to the collection of stories. Just part of the background, part of what fills in. Today we talk about the healed. We talk about the faith of speaking. A collection of the people that we're talking about. These are just some of them. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 27. When Jesus departed from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out and saying, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And when he had come into the house, the blind men came to him. And Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes, saying, "According to your faith, let it be to you." And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows it." But when they had departed, they spread the news about him in all that country. In Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 29. Now as they went out of Jericho, a great multitude followed him. And behold, 2 blind men sitting by the road, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." Then the multitude warned them that they should be quiet. But they cried out all the more, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." So Jesus stood still and called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, that our eyes may be opened." So Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes. And immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. Mark chapter 1, starting in verse 40. Now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said, "I am willing, be cleansed." And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way. Show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them." However, he went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the matter, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter the city, but was outside in deserted places. And they came to him from every direction. Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 31. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and who had an impediment in his speech. And they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears. And he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one. But the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." To give you some background information on these people. These were not the greats of society. These were never the people that were going to be kings. These were the dregs. These were the lowest, the outcasts. These were people without a place. These were people that, because of their physical condition, their culture looked at them and said they must have committed some horrible sin, or their parents must have committed some horrible sin for them to end up like this. It's what they were looked at. It's how society saw them. But they found Christ. And they not only found him, but they asked for his help. I think there's a whole nother sermon in that for us. But they asked for his help. And when they asked him, they didn't just say, "Oh, well, you can probably do it." They gave him their faith. They put their faith in him. They said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can do it." And they received the healing. They received the healing that could only come from Christ. Lepers were not allowed, under Jewish law, they were not allowed to approach people. They were not, if they saw you down the road, they had to cry out, "Leper, leper, and let me go over here so that you can keep going." These were the dregs of society. These were the lowest of the lowest class. But make no mistake, without Christ, you and I are no better off than they were. In fact, without Christ, you and I are much worse off than they ever were. I have a question. And this is especially for those who grew up in the church. Do we really understand, do you really understand what your life looked like before God, before you were washed in the blood of the Lamb? Do we really understand what that looked like? We generally think of it, a lot of people, myself included for a long time. We tend to think, oh, well, I used to sin. I had sin in my life. It wasn't good. I was pretty dirty. Sometimes I even liked it. We'll even tell stories about, times where we did some pretty bad stuff. Do we realize what that really looked like? It's not just a little bit of sin that we're healed from. Even if you grew up in the church. I grew up in a large, very strong, pretty conservative church. Really great place. It does not mean that I was somehow more clean when I was baptized than someone else. Before we are His, before we have our sins washed away, regardless of where we come from, we come to Christ depraved, dark, ghastly, and rotten to the core. There is no good in us before we are Christ, because it's been corrupted by the sin. Do we understand what that means? And yet, He saw fit to send Christ to wash away our sin so that that's not what we are anymore. See, we were never basically good people. Before I had Christ, I was never basically a good person. Now, ask my friends, ask other adults when I was growing up. They'll say, "Oh yeah, he was a good kid." No, I wasn't. Paul says in Romans that while we were what? While we were sinners. He also says that while we were still what? While we were still enemies, Christ died for us. Consider that. Consider that. While we were enemies, not neutral, not someone sitting over on the sidelines, not someone not involved, while we were enemies, while our lives were actively against God, He sent Christ. This means that we were in the same category as murderers and liars and adulterers and all the worst of humanity. We need to understand what we have been saved from. It's not just a little bit of dirt. It's not just a little bit of dirt. And yet, on that wall over there, go ahead and look. on that wall over there. Probably the most well-known verse in the whole Bible. For God so loved the world. That means you, means me, that he gave his one and only begotten Son. We know in 1 John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Gave himself, that whosoever believes on him, not our goodness, not our friends, not our parents, not the preacher, not the elders, not Mother Teresa, whoever believes on him should not perish, should not burn in hell, should not be separated from God, should not be cut off from his presence, should not be removed from his family, should not perish, but have everlasting life. See, it goes even beyond what we were saved from. It also goes to what we were saved to. While we were enemies, God saw fit to make us part of his family, to become our Father. Do we truly understand that? Do we truly accept that? See, we've been healed from something greater than any physical malady we could come across. We've been saved from something worse than any cancer, worse than any auto accident, worse than any sickness, worse than anything we could ever face on this planet. We've been saved from that. Because you see, we've been healed from a sickness so deep and so thick that it corrupted our entire being from the inside out. And now, for those who are his, for those who have had their sins washed away in that, it's not who we are anymore. We have been made pure. We have been made holy. We have been made perfect before God. Consider that divide, because I can't think of something big enough to describe it. These people that we just read about, these healed that we just read about, could not help but tell everyone they knew. Jesus told them not to go and tell people, and they couldn't stop. Because they were healed from blindness, they were healed from deafness, they were healed from leprosy, they were healed from disease. And we've been healed from something so much bigger. How can we not share that with those around us? There's an understanding we need to have of the enormity of our salvation, of the enormity of God's love for us. And if you haven't received that yet, if you haven't become his yet, then now's the time to receive that love, to receive that forgiveness, to receive that closeness with God, to not be cut off anymore. Because the blood of Christ does not just wash away a little bit of dirt. It washes us completely and utterly and wholly from the inside out. And if we've been slacking off, if we've forgotten what that means, now's the time to remember. You see, this sermon isn't about the healed that we were reading about. The sermon is about us. We are the healed. We are those made whole. And so as you start going through this week, as you go forward, remember what that means. And be ready to share it one way or another. Ask your server at the restaurant if you could pray for him. It might freak him out. They also might tell you something to pray for. Tell your coworker, as awkward as that could get. We've been healed from something much, much greater than we could ever describe. Let us remember that, and let us take action about it. And let us start right now as we stand and as we sing.